working on a PowerPoint, and I had a lot of notes, and lo and behold, I left them at home. So this morning, we're going to do it the old-fashioned way. What do you say? We're just going to put it out there and let the cards fall where they may. Habakkuk 2:2, Habakkuk said, make it plain upon the tables. That's my intention this morning. I want to make some things plain, and I want to put my cards out where everybody can see them, and so they can all critique it. And I'm not saying I have all the answers. The Lord knows I certainly do not. I may be an error on how I'm approaching this. I may have some things wrong, and I'm counting on my good brethren to help in assisting me to understanding things better as we continue our walk together. And with that said, let me get rid of this phone that's going to keep going crazy. Give me just a second here. Let's put that to the side. Revelation chapter 20 has been assigned to me. And I said, oh, thank you, Holger. I said, that is the hardest chapter, in my estimation, for me, that I've ever seen in my life in the entire Bible, is Revelation chapter 20. There's so many caveats, there's so many nuances, there's so many things taking place in Revelation chapter 20 that are so extremely metaphorical, if I can say it that way. John said that these things would be signified in Revelation 1:1, and he certainly meant it when it came to Revelation 20, and I know everybody feels that way about the chapters they've had in Revelation. But as we get into Revelation, we're going to look at a lot of things, and I'm just going to go down verse by verse by verse. I'm just going to tell you what I'm thinking at this time in my studies to the best of my ability. So let's begin with verse 1. Revelation chapter 20. And I saw an angel come down from heaven, having the key of the bottomless pit, and a great chain in his hand, and he laid hold on the dragon, that old serpent, which is the devil and Satan, and bound him 1,000 years, and cast him into the bottomless pit, and shut him up, and set a seal upon him, that he should deceive the nations no more, till the 1,000 years should be fulfilled, and after that he must be loosed a little season. I read the first 3 verses in a row because we're going to look, it's hard just to go verse by verse by verse until you get a little bit more of what's taking place here. In Revelation chapter 20, we have the angel come down from heaven. He has the key of the bottomless pit and a great chain in his hand. In Matthew chapter 16, Jesus Christ said, I will build my church, and I'm going to give you, Peter, the keys to the kingdom. And the keys to the kingdom would unlock the entranceway into the heavenly. Well, the keys into the realm of death would unlock the way, and people can know the way into the bottomless pit, the darkness, the place of torments, if you will. This is metaphorical language, and this key is this. When you know the truth, and you know the gospel, and you know what is being taught, darkness is being replaced with the light. Light's coming in, the darkness is going out, and the key to understanding that is our knowledge in Jesus Christ. Christ came, and like he gave Peter the keys to the kingdom of heaven, we also have the keys to what puts one in darkness into the bottomless pit. This is not talking about a literal physical key and a literal physical bottomless pit and a literal physical chain. What was binding Satan at the time was the truth of God's word, and everybody could see it and everybody could know it. He was an evil entity. Anybody who is in sin and in error is exposed by the light, and the key to that is the gospel. The gospel's the key. And by the gospel, this person can be known as an evil entity, and he's no longer in light. He's cast into the bottomless pit. What's the bottomless pit? Whoa. Sometimes what we have to do is we have to back up. At least for me personally, I compare opposites. And that's how I understand something sometimes. You look at the opposite of something, all of a sudden you can start understanding it better, the opposite point. For example, comfort. Did you know we couldn't truly understand comfort unless there was discomfort? Unless there was pain and agony? Without pain and agony, you can never appreciate comfort. If you always had comfort and there was no pain, you would never know what pain is, and you couldn't truly appreciate or understand the comfort. Well, it's the same thing with the heavenly. In Ephesians chapter 2, verse 6, the church at Ephesus was in the heavenly. Ephesians chapter 2, verse 6. All right? If they were in the heavenly, then how is it evil people are in the bottomless pit? Or this personage of Satan. How's he in the bottomless pit? It's the exact same image. Through the light of the gospel, one's lifted into heaven, and by the exposing of the gospel, those who refuse it, they're in darkness, they're in the bottomless pit. This isn't talking about literal fire. This isn't talking about a literal place where doors open up and literal smoke comes out. And just like Holger uses this example often. This will resonate with my brother Holger. I hope it does with you. In Ephesians chapter 2, verse 6, the Bible says there that they were in the heavenly. Places there is italicized. The translators added that. They were in the heavenly. How did they get in the heavenly? Did they go out and get a step ladder and walk up higher and get up in the air and say, look, I'm not on the earth now. I'm up here. I'm higher. I'm in the heavenly? Certainly not. They were in the heavenly, as in spiritually they had accepted the light shining, they had been lifted to the glory, and it's the same thing as going into the bottomless pit in darkness. Oh, you reject that? The keys tell us you are in darkness and you've been cast down. The message of the gospel was powerful. It was coming out. It was resonating through this time period. But there would come a point in time when there would be a great falling away, you see. Oh, a little season? I believe so. When the devil's loose? Yes. People start rejecting the gospel. They start saying, well, it's been almost a generation. The temple's still here. Jerusalem's still a great falling away. Oh, the devil's loose for a little season. We're going to get into that in just a few more moments. So, he lays hold on this dragon, the old devil. The powers of the gospel. He does it by the power of the gospel. And he binds him 1,000 years with the truth. Everybody can see and know who's right and who's wrong. That's the idea. And everybody, the multitudes are coming. Things are happening. Honest people are accepting it. Christians are staying faithful. There's going to become a great falling away, though, when this evil influence would bring them back out of the good way into a bad way. And in verse 3, cast him into the bottomless pit, shut him up, the gospel's reigning, set a seal upon him. Here's that seal. Just like the seal of the Christian. Well, we talked about this yesterday regarding Revelation 14. God didn't pop him with a 666 on his forehead. Didn't go to Staples and buy a rubber stamp and say, oh, you're a Christian, 777, pop. No, the seal is what is their actions, what they're doing, how they're doing it. You can see it through their life. And that is made to light through, again, the gospel of Jesus Christ, okay? So, he's cast into the bottomless pit. He shut him up, set a seal upon him that he should deceive the nations no more, till the 1,000 years should be fulfilled. And after that, he must be loosed a little season. I believe this 1,000 years began with the preaching of John. That's what I believe at this point in my studies. And I believe it ended at 66.5 AD. Because we have to give room for the little season of the deception of the nations coming against Jerusalem. And I believe John and Peter in 2 Peter 3 is drawing from Psalms chapter 90. In Psalms chapter 90, verse 4, the psalmist would write throughout that chapter, teach us to number our days, O Lord. Well, your days will be as 1,000 years, and it will seem as yesterday, a day past, once it's come. It'll be as a thief in the night. And then what's going to happen? God's wrath will come upon this people. When did God's wrath come upon Israel? It came when they were encompassed with armies. That's when it began. God's wrath came. They're encompassed with armies. They are in war. They're in besiegement for 3.5 years. The 1,000 years, when the 1,000 years have come, the wrath of God comes. Now Jerusalem's encompassed with armies. Now God's people's in tribulation. And the devil's loose. The gospel's waning. It's going out of the hearts of many. The great falling away happens. And now all of a sudden, the wicked comes and starts overtaking again. He comes up out of this bottomless pit to deceive the nations, to destroy God's old covenant holy people. Wow. I think that we have something happening here that is very profound if we will allow ourselves to get rid of the carnal mind. These are metaphorical, symbolic images used to help us understand what was taking place in a dual reality. We have, at the same time, several things taking place. We have the fall of Jerusalem taking place, which is a sign that the spiritual reality of that is taking place behind the scenes. That is what this is depicting. The spiritual language of God is showing how all this is taking place. Well, let's move on quickly. Let's move into verse 4. I saw thrones, and they that sat upon them, and judgment was given unto them. Stop right there. This verse give me more trouble. This verse and the next two give me more trouble than any other. I was always taught, and I believed, and I thought I saw myself, that verse 4 is only talking about the martyrs who are under the altar of God. I don't believe that's correct. I think that is a misapplication. In Revelation chapter 1, verse number 6, the Bible says there that the Lord made his people kings and priests. In Revelation chapter 20, verse 4, it says, I saw the thrones. Who sits on a throne? Kings, right? And they that sat upon them, and judgment was given unto them. Oh, they have judgment? Yes, they have the gospel of Jesus Christ, that they can rule through their authority because they're kings and priests. This is talking about the living Christians who are there when John's writing to the 7 churches of Asia. These people, they're sitting on thrones. They're reigning with the Lord. And by the way, if you're a child of the Lord, you're a prince or a princess. You are seated in a spiritual throne of authority. He's the King of Kings. If you're his child, you're a prince to the king. You have authority. You're sitting under his throneship in the thrones of the king. He's made us kings and priests. So this is talking about people who were alive right then and there, reigning, sitting on the thrones with him. Now watch this carefully. I saw the thrones, and they that sat upon them, and judgment was given unto them. And, anybody here familiar with Mark 16:16? Oh, he that believeth and is baptized. We have two different things there with a result coming. That word and is a conjunction, isn't it? I saw those who were ruling. I saw those who were reigning. I saw those who had authority given unto them. And I saw something else. What did you see, John? I saw the souls of them that were beheaded for the witness of Jesus, for the word of God, which had not worshipped the beast, neither his image, neither had received his mark upon their foreheads or in their hands. And they lived and reigned with Christ 1,000 years. These are those who died faithfully as Christian martyrs. So, John says, I see the kings and the priests. I see those who are on thrones, and judgment was given to them. And I see those who died for the cause of Jesus Christ. Oh, and what did they do? They lived and reigned with Christ for this 1,000 years. What happens at the end of the 1,000 years? The wrath of God comes. The wrath of God comes upon that old covenant people. Well, let's take a look at verse 5. But the rest of the dead live not again till the 1,000 years were finished. Who's the rest of the dead? All right, let's stop. Let's think about this for a moment. We have those who are living and reigning with Christ presently then when this was written. And we have those who died as martyrs as Christians. Well, who could possibly be the rest of the dead that would live? The only plausible explanation is the Old Testament worthies. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, David, Solomon. Oh, Samuel? Yeah, I think so. The rest of the dead are those who died before the coming of Jesus, before the 1,000 years, you see. The rest of the dead died before, but they were the faithful dead. Didn't Jesus say something about you'll sit at my table with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? Were they baptized into Christ? No. They were under another covenant before that, weren't they? The rest of the dead, but they're faithful to God, well, they got what's going to happen to them. They're going to be brought back to life too. But the rest of the dead, the old covenant worthies, live not again until the 1,000 years were finished. Watch this carefully. This is the first resurrection. Wow. This too has caused me great consternation. The first resurrection? How's this work? We have a woman today in the United States of America. Her name is Melania Trump. She's our first lady. Is she our first lady? Everybody, yeah. Melania Trump's the first lady. She's the president's wife. Who was the first lady of the United States of America? Wasn't it some woman named Martha Washington? Then how is it Melania's the first if Martha preceded her 2 centuries ago? How is Melania? See, she's not the first numerically as in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Otherwise, she'd be like the 40th, right? She's the 40th lady. No. In 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 15, the Apostle Paul wrote that Christ came into the world to save sinners, of whom I am protos first. Same exact word. But in 1 Timothy 1:15, Brent, the translators translated that chief, of whom I'm chief, not number one. Paul wasn't the very first sinner in this world, and it's ridiculous for anybody to think that. But he was a great, big, huge sinner. He was responsible for the death of the martyr Stephen, in fact. So this word first here can be, and a lot of times is, translated as chief or chiefest or most supreme. And when you look at the first resurrection, it's not the idea that it was the first numerically and now there's a number 2 coming. It's the idea that it's the most greatest, high, supreme resurrection. What resurrection could be greater or higher than the resurrection from Hades? From the resurrection of the just and unjust, which is where the martyrs would have to rise from, which is where the Old Testament worthies would have to come from. They'd have to come out of Hades. The resurrection of the just and unjust would take place, most certainly. Well, my goodness, isn't that the greatest, most chief, highest, supreme resurrection of all time? Resurrection cannot be numbered. It cannot be. Why? There's no end to it. Isaiah chapter 9 says there's no end to the increase of God's kingdom. How is the only way you can get into God's kingdom? You're resurrected from death into life. You come from the dead. Well, when's it going to end? It never will end. Well, who is number 2? There is. It's innumerable. Oh. John said, I saw 144,000, Revelation chapter 7. Repeated it again in Revelation chapter 14. The 144,000, from the 12 tribes of Israel. I believe 144,000 there is used to represent a fixed number. No more from the 12 tribes of Israel could be added. None. It couldn't be 144,001. It couldn't be 144,015. It was sealed. It was set. It was a direct number. But then John said, and I saw an innumerable company. Why, John? Because the gospel's innumerable. It's eternal. It never ends. Forever people will be. You can't calculate that. So first here, I believe, is chief or greatest or highest or supreme. I don't believe it's numerical here. With that in mind, let's continue to see. So this great resurrection, if you put the word chief or chiefest or greatest resurrection into the text, now all of a sudden you're seeing, I think, the realistic picture that God wants you to see. My opinion at this point. Look at verse 6. Blessed and holy is he that hath part in the chief resurrection, the great resurrection. On such the second death hath no power, but they shall be priests of God and of Christ, and shall reign with him 1,000 years. Somebody said, Baisden, I got you. I got you dead to rights now, buddy, because how, if they were dead in Hades, were they reigning during that 1,000 years? If the 1,000 years begin in 30, and they died before that, how are they living and reigning? Oh, have you ever read Hebrews 11, verse 4? He being dead yet speaketh. Haven't you ever considered that the New Testament apostles and Christians were walking by the words of those Old Testament prophets, and those words those Old Testament prophets spoke, and they were following that, and that was their rule? That was their reigning? During when? The 1,000 years? Didn't Jesus say in Matthew 5:18, the Old Covenant law couldn't end until it's all fulfilled? Yes. That means the Old Covenant law was still reigning. And they lived and they reigned with Christ for this 1,000-year period, and then the wrath of God would come. That's what's taking place in Revelation chapter 20. I'm convinced of it. Now, I have a lot of people looking at me like I've just flipped my lid.
Yeah, you dropped your mic.
Oh, thank you, Chad. It went into the bottomless pit there, buddy. The bird cage.
Flip the mic.
All right. All right, folks, I'm sorry. A lot of people looking at me like I flipped my lid. Brethren, when you start trying to force material, carnal, physical words into something that's very highly metaphorical and symbolic, representative of something else, And God's words are spiritual words. Make no mistake. The words that I speak, they are spirit and they are life. And you start forcing a physical bottomless pit, a physical 1,000 years, a physical chain, a physical this. And you messed it all up already. You've already missed it. Right now we have, when God's wrath comes, something very particular taking place. Let's follow it because this will continue to develop. Verse number 6, blessed and holy is he that takes part in the first resurrection, chief resurrection. On such the second death hath no power, but they shall be priests of God and of Christ and shall reign with him 1,000 years. So, this second death is none other than Hades being cast down. Hades is cast down in Revelation chapter, we'll get to that. The second death is death and Hades being cast down into the lake of fire. That's what and so let's continue for now. Look at verse 7. And when the 1,000 years are expired, Satan shall be loosed out of his season. The church is operating. Things are going, they're having their troubles. But generally speaking, I think the church remained faithful until a certain point in time when folks started saying, it's been long enough, this should have happened. And you know what? Maybe we made a mistake. Maybe we need to go back. Which is what Paul was warning Timothy about, Hymenaeus and Philetus, causing some to believe that the resurrection was past already, and so he was overthrowing their faith. They're going back to Judaism, which is what was happening in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 as well. There's a great falling away. Christ said there would be a great falling away come, right? Yes, that's what he said. So, when Satan is loosed out of his prison, out of that bottomless pit, it's the idea of the gospel now is not having the effect on people that it used to have, and the evil ways are coming back up out of there. And they're going to almost take over. In John chapter 5, you know what Jesus said? When I return, if there be faith found upon the land, the earth, the world. He even wondered if there would be any faithful left at his return. You see, there would be a great falling away. That is people leaving the gospel, right? Coming back into a world of sin, a world of death, maybe even going back to Judaism. Okay, so I think that's what we have taking place here. The 1,000 years are expired. Great falling away. Satan shall be loosed out of his season. He's deceiving people, right? Deceiving them from what? The gospel. So they're becoming evil. That's what's happening. And they shall go out to deceive the nations, that's Zechariah 14, 1 and 2, which are in the four quarters of the earth, Gog and Magog, that's Ezekiel 38, that's Ezekiel 39, to gather together to battle, the number of whom is as the sand of the sea. Now, folks, in Ezekiel chapter 38 and 39, Gog and Magog are mentioned there specifically by name, that they would come with the rest of the Gentile nations against Israel in Israel's last days. I never forget Holger's having a conversation with a man, and they were discussing this Revelation chapter 20. And Holger asked him, well, who do you suppose Gog and Magog are? Oh, it's the Muslims. They're going to come after us one day, soon, in our future. Oh, no. Haven't you read Ezekiel 38? Gog and Magog would come against Israel in their last days. Now, if Israel's no longer God's covenant people, and Jesus was correct, all the righteous blood shed upon the earth, he held them responsible for, and they would go down in that generation, then that makes his Muslim idea, or your Hitler idea, or any futurist idea of Gog and Magog, it throws it right out the window, that's gone. There's no way that that can happen. Gog and Magog is the Gentile nations coming against Israel. That's what it is. And it would happen in their last days because Christianity has no last days. It is eternal. So we have the 1,000 years are expired. Satan will be loosed out of his prison. The gospel is waning its influence. People are going back to Judaism, back to sin. This thing's deceiving people, so they come against Israel, which they think Christianity is just a sect of Judaism at this point, right? And what happens? Well, they gather them together to battle. The numbers as the sand of the sea. Everybody wants these people put down. Verse 9. And they went up on the breadth of the earth, and compassed the camp of the saints about, and the beloved city, and fire came down from God out of heaven and devoured them. That is, that holy city, that beloved city, and metaphorically devoured all these nations coming against them as well. Why? Because the gospel now rules over everyone, and its victory over that old covenant world. God came in vengeance and judgment, just like he promised upon Israel when the nations of the earth, Gog and Magog, and their allies would come against that beloved city, which is Jerusalem, and those old covenant saints. Look at verse 10. Let's continue. Verse 10 says, "And the devil that deceived them was cast into the lake of fire and brimstone, where the beast and the false prophet are, and shall be tormented day and night forever and ever." Judgment takes place when Israel, that beloved city, falls and the nation comes against it. Verse 11. And I'm going to come back a little bit to some of these things, so just hang on to some thoughts. "And I saw a great white throne." Here's this judgment throne. "And him that sat on it, from whose face the earth and heaven fled away, and there was found no more place for them." For who? This earth and this heaven. Heaven and earth. Well, you mean the new heaven? No, this can't be the new. This is the old heaven and earth coming before God in judgment. There was no place found for them. They're put out of God's presence. They're put down. You better believe it. For what purpose? For the new heaven and the new earth that's coming in Revelation chapter 21. The new heaven and the new earth is coming in Revelation chapter 21. There's no place found for the old one that's before the judgment throne of God here. And so all of a sudden we have the old heaven and the old earth. It fled away. It can no longer be in the presence of God. And there was found no place for them. And I saw the dead, small and great, stand before God. And the books were open, and another book was opened, which is the book of life. And the dead were judged out of those things which were written in the books according to their works. This is almost a repeating of what we read earlier. Watch this carefully. "I saw the dead, both small and great, stand before God." Go back up to Revelation chapter 20, verse 5. "And the rest of the dead lived not again to the 1,000 years." This is a retelling of what took place earlier about the sign of Jerusalem falling. Earlier is what's taking place when Gog and Magog would come against Jerusalem. But now it's talking about the spiritual reality that's taking place behind the scenes of that physical destruction. One is a sign of what was taking place physically that represented the spiritual reality that's taking place later in this chapter. Listen, there's not many different judgments. There's not many different comings of the Lord and wrath. There's not many different new heavens and new earths and old heavens and old earths. There's not many different resurrections of the just and the unjust. There's one. So when the Bible, when you're reading about several different ones, and you think one's here and one's there, and this, that, and all, there's a whole bunch of them, we've got to stop for a moment, realize that there's only one great judgment, one great resurrection, the chief one, the big kahuna, if I can say it that way. Right? But there would be a sign for it. So we would be able to see one in some way, but the other we can't see in some way. It's spiritual. How could you see the resurrection, Satan being loosed for a little season? How could you see that if it's spiritual? By the sign. How could you see it? By their sealing. That's what it said. Well, how could you know if they're sealed? By what they thought, by what they believed, and what they did. Those evil people came against Jerusalem. They pronounced their own judgment upon themselves. God's people saw it. They saw it. Now they know what's taking place behind the scenes. Verse 11 and 12 and 13. The spiritual world. Now the great white throne judgment set. The judgment of Jerusalem came. Physical. Yep. Could we see it? Yep. Was Satan loosed out of the bottom of his pit? I saw it. Just like I saw Christ resurrect spiritually from the dead as well. Just like when I commune with Christ, I now have a different perspective of that, but just like I can see Christ hanging on a cross with his broken body and his shed blood, I can see Satan coming out of the bottomless pit the same way. How could I see it through the gospel? I walk by faith, not by sight. You mean just with heavenly things? No. To be fair, we have to walk by faith and not by sight with all spiritual things, those which are wicked and evil, and those which are good and just and right. If I can see heaven in a way that the Ephesians were lifted up into heaven spiritually, then I can see a bottomless pit in a way where Satan's cast down there spiritually. Just like the Ephesians, if they left their face, they can leave the heavenly. So too, those who are in evil can leave that place, that bottomless pit, the world of darkness, and come into the light of His dear Son. And it's not talking about literal things. When we get into verse 12, all of a sudden here we have a repeating of the story, but I believe one is physical regarding the physical sign, and the other spiritual regarding the spiritual reality of the end of things taking place behind the scenes in a spiritual way. And I saw the dead, small and great, stand before God. That's the resurrection of the just and unjust. Where were the dead, by the way? Listen. Before the second coming of Christ, the dead would go to a place known as Hades. And that's where they were. That's where their conscience was. That's where the rich men would beg for water. That's where the thief would be with Christ. This day shalt thou be with me in paradise. That's where their conscience was. That's where the real them was. That old physical body, why Solomon said that's going back to the dust of the ground from which it came. It's the soul that goes back to God. So when we're looking at this resurrection of this just and unjust, they were in Hades, that spiritual realm. Physical bodies aren't coming out from anywhere. This is the great spiritual judgment now that John's talking about. And the books were open. And another book, Daniel chapter 12, verse 1, they would be standing and the book would be opened. And I thought it interesting that those people Daniel was talking about there, the book was open. But here we have books, plural. I think we're talking about the old covenant and the new covenant. People being judged. Now, if you died under the old, that book would judge you. You die under the new, that book would judge you. The books are open in judgment. No matter when you died, no matter what covenant you died under, you're now standing spiritually before God. That's what's taking place here in my estimation. The books were open and another book was open, which is the book of life. And the dead were judged out of those things which were written in the books according to their works. Matthew 16, 27, 28. I'm going to judge every man according to his works. When, Lord? Well, some of you shall not taste death till it happens, that's for sure. What are you going to do? I'm coming with my angels. I'm coming in the glory of the Father. I'm going to judge every man according to his works. Every man? Yep. Everybody. Just and unjust? Yep. Just like Daniel said, Daniel 12. Okay. And the sea gave up the dead. I want you to notice the distinction here. Earlier in this chapter, it's talking about the saints and the dead that would live, the faithful. Now, all of a sudden, it's talking about the Gentiles. It's talking about not only the just, but the unjust, you see. All of a sudden now, there's a little different of a nuance. This is the great resurrection. This is the resurrection in the spiritual realm taking place against the sign of the physical, which was mentioned earlier when Gog and Magog came upon the city of Jerusalem. Nobody can deny that's not physical. Oh, it certainly was. But there were spiritual things taking place behind the scenes, and they could witness it by that physical event. But now, the sea gave up her dead. Sea means Gentiles. Revelation 17:15, and the waters that thou sawest, what are they? The peoples, the tongues, and the nations. That's the waters. Is sea a water? It's H2O, yeah. Isaiah chapter 20, the sea shall be converted to the Lord. I'm not talking about H2O. And, you know, my grandson's got a bottle of water sitting next to him. You think that can be baptized into Christ somehow? No, that's ridiculous. Sea means Gentiles. Now, the people that were God's covenant people and the people outside of that covenant now are all coming into judgment because earlier Jerusalem was judged. And that had to happen before or during or right near that same time of the spiritual, the rest of the spiritual realm taking place, you see. And they were judged, it says, out of those things which were written in the books according to their works. Jesus clearly said that would take place in his disciples' lifetime 2,000 years ago. And in verse 13, the Bible says, the sea gave up the dead and which were in it. When I was a little boy, I would read the book of Revelation. Mom and Dad were Christians, and we went to church, and I grew up going to church every Sunday, and I had a great interest in the Bible my whole life. And I would read about the sea giving up the dead, and I thought, well, you know what? That makes perfect sense. All those sailors that died and their bodies went to the bottom of the sea. Yeah. And you know, those men who fought in World War II in those submarines, and they're laying at the bottom of the... That's what I used to think, right? Well, and then I remember watching men walk on the moon in 1969 when I was a little boy on TV. Black and white. I can remember it. Not real well, but I remember it. And I would think, what about the people... Now, the sea's going to give up their dead. What about people who die on the moon? What about people in outer space? Is it going to give up its... And I'm thinking all physical, all carnal. This is talking about spiritually, and the sea is talking about the Gentile world. Those that were outside the law of Moses are going to be judged as well at this time, at this point. That's what's happening. And the sea gave up the dead which were in it, and death and hell, that's Hades, delivered up the dead which are in them, and they were judged every man according to their works. We all know here know when that was. 14, and death and hell were cast into the lake of fire. This is the second death. And those who died in that 1,000-year period, and after that whole period ended, you never had to worry about second death again. Why? Because I'm a Christian and I never have to die again. And Hades, hell, cast into the lake of fire. It's gone. I don't have to worry about that anymore. That's for sure. I'm a Christian that never has to die again. That's the second death. And if I'm faithful and I'm saved now, I don't have to worry about those things. That was for another people, another time, for another thing. Now, I'm not saying that there is no eternal place of torments after this life for us today. But this one, as it was for them, that's gone. There's no more separation from God. Hades is no longer there. That second death, which is 1 Corinthians 15, 55, and 56, right? O death, where's thy sting? O Hades, where's thy victory? Death has no more sting. Hades has no more victory. Why? They're cast out. And you don't have to worry about that. There's no more second death for those that believe and honor the Lord. Verse 15, and whosoever was not found written in the book of life was cast into the lake of fire. That is the great white judgment throne of things taking place when Hades was judged. And I think one picture earlier in the book is drawn for those who would see things happening in Jerusalem physically as it was foretold throughout all. And the other picture is drawn for others who are seeing it like us today, who could see it spiritually, as it spiritually would be being applied. It's a repeat of the same story for a particular reason. These people are gone. That proves death and Hades is now gone. And that's my take on Revelation 20 at this point in time. Hope you were able to follow. I went quite fast, and I saw a lot of people going, whoof. So I don't have an outline, but it's in my head. So there you go.
Give me your microphone.
Oh, yeah.
There you go. Thank you.
Yep. A little different.
I don't know. Are you paranoid or something?
No.
That was good work. I appreciate that. We just wish you would have presented it like you actually believed it. No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. Good work, Steve. And I especially like the retelling of the event. And so these are good ideas. They really are good ideas. And I think I've said before, you give Steve Baisden enough time and just give him some rest, and he'll do as good as anyone when he puts his mind on a text. So I appreciate that very much. And we know when it took place. We know there's only one little time, right? So the futurists, they have more little times than your wife has in the mall, right? They have more comings than the post office. They have more ends than Old MacDonald. Here an end, there an end, everywhere an end, and. And when you begin to put in the framework of the at hand in the beginning of the book, at the hand in the beginning of the book, you begin to put the puzzle together. And so we appreciate that very much. I especially appreciate what you said about the first resurrection. Now that makes sense to me. I had thought that John 5, John is the revelator. He writes the Gospel of John, and I saw two resurrections there, but really it's not. It's the same with the one. It's just the culmination of the same thing. All covered in Israel coming back to life. Soon the dead ones would have their life, and everyone would have their life. So that makes now sense. I see that. That's good. And so usually Steve and I debate back and forward for at least a couple of days before anything is presented that I present or he presents, but we hadn't got the opportunity to do that. That's okay. I don't think I could have gainsaid or withstood that. That makes sense. So the great resurrection, right? The great resurrection. And those of you that might have a different take on it, go ahead and present it. We've got a couple of minutes here. Before usually I have to shut Steve down, and he's stopped about 10 minutes earlier. Daniel, if you'd like to come up and offer some suggestions, that's fine. We're here to study, by the way. And iron sharpens iron, and we're glad to just go on in there and say something.
Get into the cage. All right, let's open up to Revelation chapter 20 for a moment. Now, Steve, I appreciate your comments. I definitely was intrigued, especially by the comment about the first resurrection being the chief resurrection. But I think there's I see a problem with it right now, but maybe you can clear it up for me.
Maybe.
All right.
I don't have all the nuances worked out, that's for sure.
Okay. Let's try to track this down. And I have the benefit of having a notepad that I can write everything out on, and so maybe that would help if we had something like that. But I guess we'll just stick with it like in the mind right now. So he says in verse 2, he laid hold of the dragon, the serpent of old, who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years. And then you see in verse 3, he's released after the 1,000 years is completed. And so really, Satan's binding and his releasing is the two bookends of the millennium. Okay, so everything fits within that, all right? So that shows you when the millennium began. Doesn't matter when it began in the year, we just know it has to correspond with Satan's binding. Right. I have a different opinion about the binding, but that's not really the point.
What is it?
I think Hebrews 2:14, Satan's power was removed at the cross. He destroyed him he had destroyed him who had power over death, that is the devil, by death he did that. But
I think it goes back even earlier to the temptation of Christ in the wilderness. Once he passed.
Okay, that's fine. All right, I just wanted to give his idea. Go ahead.
right, okay, so you have the 1,000 years, so Satan's bound and Satan's released. We can just agree on that. We don't have to put a date on it right now. In verse 4, you have these individuals who reign with Christ for 1,000 years, okay? But this resurrection of the rest of the dead happens after the 1,000 years. Now, if the resurrection of the rest of the dead is the first resurrection of the primary resurrection, then you have them in verse 6 reigning with Christ again for another 1,000 years.
And I think that's reading into it more than what's there. In verse 6 it says, "Blessed and holy is he which takes part in the first resurrection." Now, in my estimation at this point in time, that is the Christians, right? Those who lived and were reigning, the martyrs with Christ, verse 4, and those worthies. The rest of the dead must be the worthies from the old covenant. They couldn't come back to life till after the first resurrection. I don't see a problem.
Okay, so he says in verse 5, the rest of the dead did not come to life until the 1,000 years were completed.
Right.
Okay, so when he says this is the first resurrection, you would apply that not to that. I guess we'd say that would be a parenthetical expression, but you apply that to the first verse 4.
It's all the same resurrection, the chief resurrection. Now, what I think you're doing was what I was first doing when I was looking at this. I was taking this as if this was happening before the little season, but I don't think so. This is happening. They couldn't come back to life until after the resurrection and at the final judgment scene when Jerusalem falls.
Right, the rest of the dead come to life to stand before the throne after the little season, right?
The rest of the dead come.
So the rest of the dead come to life after the 1,000 years is over.
Yeah,
after
what this is saying. After the 1,000 years, they couldn't live until after the 1,000 years. Exactly.
Okay, so the first resurrection in verse 6, blessed and holy is the one who has part in the first resurrection. you would say that would be those that were reigning with Christ in verse 4, and not the ones who come to life after the 1,000 years is over, right? So verse 6, blessed and holy is the one who has a part in the first resurrection. Over these the second death has no power, but they will be priests of God and of Christ and will reign with him for 1,000 years. That refers to those in verse 4 and not to those in verse 5. Is that correct?
No, it's all the same.
Okay, but see, so if the rest of the dead are included in this verse 6 passage, then what you have is an additional 1,000-year period after the 1,000-year
I tried
period.
to explain that in my lesson. Here's how they lived and reigned. They lived and reigned during that 1,000 years, and they didn't come back to life until after that 1,000 years, right?
Okay, I see
So
what
how
you're
were they
saying.
living and reigning during that 1,000 years? Hebrews 11:4 said, "He being dead yet speaketh," referring to righteous Abel.
Okay,
So they were reigning through their word and through their prophetic utterances, that which those in that 1,000-year period were living, which would have been the Jews for the destruction of Jerusalem, the physical event, not the spiritual event.
Do you believe they were in Hades, Daniel?
yeah, I think they were in Hades, sure. All right, that's, I'll leave it at that then, let somebody else.
And it's a little tedious. I'll give you, it's a little
Sure.
tedious right there, but I think we open up our minds and we understand this is talking about the resurrection, the destruction of Jerusalem, and not the spiritual. Now it starts making sense how the Old Testament worthies lived and reigned with them during that 1,000-year period. And then later on, after the fall of Jerusalem, is the great spiritual resurrection of the just and unjust.
All right,
It's happening behind the scenes.
sure, okay,
I'm just going to give one opinion, then we're going to stop here. So thank you, Daniel, and thank you, Steve. I appreciate the good deportment of both of you.
Yeah, thanks, Daniel.
Now, Jesus, when he went into the Hadean world, I used to have a different view of 1 Peter chapter 3, but it looks like to me, since he's the first fruits, they would have known he's the first fruits, right? Okay. So their anticipation is different after Jesus gets out of Hades than before. So in the Hadean world, they have the promises.
Yes.
Christ is the first fruits, and soon, and maybe not the day and the hour they didn't know at that time, just like the rest of those who were living, they didn't know the day and the hour.
Right off to Jesus.
So now, in the 40-year period, they're living and reigning, right, in that great resurrection, so that at that point, and through that resurrection, they're brought to the presence of God, correct? And the sea gave up the dead, the Gentiles and the Jews at the same time. So that's resonating with me. That's resonating with me. And Daniel, you have such a high functioning brain. I can't get the detail. You gotta, all right, what you need to do, get yourself a PowerPoint, show exactly what you were saying. And if I can follow it, I want to see it, because I appreciate anything you have to say. I really do. Daniel's got a unique view. So thank you very much.